An introduction to scenic painting. When did scenic painting even begin? Well, this is a topic that is actually debated among theater historians. We find references of a scenic artist named Agatharchus. We believe he was one of the first, possibly the first, scenic artist. We know of this from the Roman historian Vitruvius. It is debated whether Agatharchus was actually a painter or a constructor of the scenic pieces. Aristotle tells us that the first scenic artist, or the first person to introduce scenic art, was Sophocles, whereas Agatharchus worked for Aeschylus. So whether it was Agatharchus or someone else is yet to be determined, but it is clear from our references that scenic painting goes back nearly as far as our references as theater itself do, and that we have references to scenic artists and scenic painting as early as the Greeks. So this is something that has been part of theater throughout time and has grown and been enriched, and today is essential for what we consider to be the height of theatrical experience. This isn't going to cover the design of that, what the scenic elements look like. We're primarily concerned with how they get to look like they're supposed to, what the process is to get them from a piece of wood or a carved piece of foam to look like a building, to look like a giant sculpture, to look like a water fountain or a skyline. This is where the real scenic art comes into play. There are a few things that you need in order to create scenic art. You can do it almost anywhere, but there are a few requirements or a few characteristics of the best types of spaces that you'll want to use in order to do your scenic painting. The first characteristic of these spaces is that you have somewhere warm. This is not only beneficial to you, but it is beneficial to the paint as well. It does not want to be hot, it does not want to be cold, but warmer temperatures are typically better for scenic painting. It also wants to be very dry. This will help the dry time. It also affects the amount of accuracy you get and how the applications are intended to look and how the results actually come out. If the atmosphere is too damp, sometimes paint will settle differently. Mixtures won't go together the way that they are expected to, and your results will be different. The final characteristic is that it is a space with some sunlight or a controllable quality of light, something that allows you to try to mimic what the stage lighting might look like. But more than anything, it needs to be a place that you can see what you're working on. There are various different arrangements for how you paint, whether you paint once the set's all complete and you go on stage and you paint the set. That's typically not what we try to do here at ECU, simply because of the schedules that are kept, and professionally it's not something that's often done, as that time in the theater space is very valuable, and so you want to get into the theater and get the set together and done as quickly as possible. So they're often built and painted off-site. So a paint shop is the place to take the scenery for it to get painted. Here at ECU, we use what is referred to as a continental system. This is the also called horizontal painting, or painting down, painting flat. Let me rotate out a little bit just so you can get a view if you haven't seen it before. This is what our paint deck at East Carolina University looks like. So this is where we paint all of the shows that are brought out onto our main stage, whether it be flats or backdrops, this is where that magic happens. Other shops are set up with space to do this as well, but maybe they don't have as much floor space available. Maybe the paint shop and the scene shop are combined into one, and so the floor space is not an option. In a lot of these spaces, or just for the preference of the painters, you will find what is called a paint frame. Let me switch to an image of a paint frame. This is a picture of two students working on a paint frame. They have some flats that are attached to the paint frame. You can see the framework behind the piece that they're painting. At their feet you can see what appears to be the lip of a paint trough. And so the paint frame can actually raise and lower out of this trough so that they don't have to stand on a ladder or they don't have to bend over, and that they're able to adjust to paint the exact spot that they need. Here's a diagram of what the mechanics of this can sometimes look like. You have a weight system and a pulleys, and so you have a frame that is able to raise and lower out from under the ground. And so your floor level is much higher than the base level, the lowest point of the paint frame. So this requires space below your shop space. This is something that we don't have in the shop, so that might be one of the reasons that we don't have a paint frame. You can have a frame, however, without it being able to raise and lower into the ground. In this situation, you would use what is called a boomerang. This is a boomerang. As you can see, it has numerous levels and ladders and workspaces, allowing the painter to climb to different spots on the boomerang, and that gives them access to different spots on the painted backdrop that is attached to a frame on the wall. As you can see at the base of this boomerang, there are numerous wheels. And so this allows you to wheel from one side to the other side. This is very similar to what a lot of theaters will do with scaffolding, only this is created specifically for a paint shop. Well, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, what if I had both a boomerang and a paint frame? Wouldn't that be amazing? Because then it could raise, lower, I could climb, I could do this, I could do that. Wouldn't that be awesome? Well, let me give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what this, the outcome of this dream might look like. This is a video from the National Theater showing how they use their paint frame and a motorized lift to paint their scenery.
The design for Revenger's Tragedy was painted on gauze, and we are very lucky here. We have a large paint frame with a bar on which we can fix the top of the gauze. We then fly that out and pin the sides of the gauze so it's stretched out. We work from working platforms that go up and down and side to side so that we can move across this material. To transfer the design onto the gauze, we take the model and we square up. We then create squares 25 times bigger on the gauze, usually by stretching a sewing cotton across in a grid pattern. We then transfer by looking at the square on the design and drawing that onto the square on the gauze. We also measure so that we get it accurate. After that, we then paint, and in this case with Scenic painting supersaturated emulsion.
Wow, that was pretty cool, wasn't it? Now that we've talked a little bit about the space needed for a paint shop, let's talk a little bit about the equipment. There is a lot of equipment in this shop. I'm sure you've already kind of gotten a glimpse at everything, and it will be very important that you learn where everything goes. The cleanliness of this paint shop is essential to the productivity of it, and so I will be kind of the cleaning Nazi and coming in throughout the semester, and I expect to see the shop clean at all times. So when you use something, put it away. When you're done with something, make sure that no one else is using it. Let's just take good care of this place. Some of the basic materials that we use are containers. We use lots of containers, whether they be small containers, gallon buckets, or even 5-gallon buckets, or somewhere in between. We use a lot of containers. The thing that I want you to remember about this is, again, about the cleanliness. That if you get a container and you want to mix paint in it, if there is a remnant of the last time somebody had this container and used it, and a little bit of that paint gets into your paint will be contaminated. And it's very easy for colors contamination to take what you're doing and working on and take it in a completely wrong direction. So make sure to properly clean out all of our containers and store them where they need to go. Behind me, you can see that there is storage for a lot of our plastic containers. Down below this, under the shelf to the left of the sink, is where we store gallon-sized buckets. And to the right of the sink area on the shelving is a large quantity of 5-gallon buckets. It's really hard not to see where these things go, so I expect for them to be put away properly. And they will become your friends as well if you label them, because they all look the same, right? And one of the things that I want you to remember about labeling your containers is always to label the container and not the lid. That is something very important to remember, because labeling the container, that will go with the paint. The lids, however, when you take a whole bunch of lids off, maybe the lids will get put onto different paint really quickly. Especially if I'm cleaning up for you. I'm not going to look at whether the lid has a label on it or not. I'm going to look at the container of paint, and I'm going to put a lid on it. I'm not going to look to make sure it's the right one. So A, don't let me do that, because that would be me cleaning up for you, which is bad. And B, don't label your lids, label your containers. The other thing to note about containers on 1-gallon buckets, this lip around the top edge of the 1-gallon bucket. When you put the lid on, you're going to want to use a rubber mallet to hammer it in to make sure that it's sealed. That way our paint doesn't get stinky and old. But this lip will collect a lot of paint. And so you'll want to run your finger along and just get the paint out of this lip before you put the lid on. Otherwise, when you put the lid on, that paint will spray out all over everywhere. Not every time, but sometimes. And most people that come and into the shop, not all of them are wearing paint clothes, and they don't expect paint to be splashed in that upward direction. So that is one of the primary ways that people get paint on their non-paint clothes, is by improper sealing and cleaning of that lid. Some people will say to hammer little holes along the lid so that when you wash when the paint will seep through. I really hate that, because I carry buckets like this a lot and will cut my fingers on buckets when I pick them up. So please, I know that some of you might have heard that from somebody. Let's not do that technique here, because I won't like it. I'm going to switch over real quick and show you some paint carriers. This is what I will refer to as a paint carrier. This is a great one. It's on wheels, as you can see. It has a bar so that you can rest sticks upon or hang a brush from or a rag from. It also has an area in the bottom that you can put your paint cans in. And this allows you to quickly and easily move your paint from one area to the next area without it spilling your paint all over the place, or without you having to take 4 different trips, leaning over, setting things down. So it is great for your efficiency in painting. This is a rolling style. This is slightly different, and it is a carrying style. This is great if you're wanting to carry it out onto a drop, so that you don't want to roll over the drop with the wheels. If you're painting a drop, or anything really, you don't want to be rolling over it. So this style would be great for those occasions when you need to go out onto the middle of something and just set your paint buckets down without having to carry numerous trays or paint buckets. Okay, now let's talk about brushes. These are your prized possessions as a painter. You want to love them, care for them, wash them carefully. Having your own is a typical expectation as a scenic artist and is often preferred by most painters. So I strongly encourage you guys that you should start collecting your own brushes. Whether you're an actor or a technician or an educator, that having a supply of these will not fail you. You will use them. There is always, work calls for scenic artists, and it's a great way to make a few bucks and to help out, if nothing else. And so having your own brushes is great, because most of the time you go someplace and they don't have the quality or variety of brushes that we have prepared for you here at ECU. So make sure to start collecting your own brushes, as that is a standard. Most scenic artists will always show up with their own bag of brushes. Let's look at the parts of a brush. Let's switch to an image real quick. This is a diagram of the paintbrush. As you can see, there are 3 main parts that I want you to know about. I want you to know about the handle. The part that you hold is called the handle. But at the other end of the brush are the bristles. The part that takes the paint in and pushes the paint out. These are the bristles. In the middle is the ferrule. This is the connection between the handle and the bristles. It is a holding apparatus for the bristles to stay connected to the handle in a way that allows for continued use, and in a specific configuration that is often done to allow for the best intake of paint. We'll get more into this later, but these are the parts of the brush that are important to remember as a scenic artist. Let's talk about types of brushes. I have an image here of several different kinds of brushes. The first one being a primer brush. These are 5 to 6 inches in width. They are used to prime surfaces. They have soft bristles. If you find one that has harder bristles, stiffer bristles, this is either one that hasn't been properly cleaned or one that is specifically made for whitewashing. Here is an example of one from our shop. This one, as you can see, does not have much of a handle. It has the ferrule, but no handle. It has somewhat of a handle. It has a handle base and what looks to be a little hole, which will allow you to take that and to connect it to a stick. This is great for our continental system of painting on the floor, painting down, in that instead of having to bend over to paint something on the floor, that you're able to use the stick with the brush at the end to prime the surface that you need. The second brush is a lay-in brush. These come in 3, 4, and 5 inch widths. These are most widely available. This is what you see at Home Depot and Lowe's. When you're going to buy these brushes, and here's some that we have here. I love these purdy brushes. They're purdy, and they're really nice. They're a little more expensive than the other ones, but look for some of the ones that have softer bristles. if you're going to buy these brushes, get the ones that have softer bristles. The harder bristles are great for house painting, but they're not as good for scenic techniques that we use them for. This is one of the requirements for this course. It's a 4-inch lay-in brush. Number 3 on our image here is a foliage brush or a fantail. These brushes are great for foliage. You've seen, Bob Ross painting happy trees with these brushes. Number 4 is my favorite, the Fitch or liner brush. We have a lot of these located underneath the mirror to the left of the sink. These are used for a very wide variety of applications in scenic painting. And these are the brushes that having your own set of first would be great. Especially some of the smaller ones, because those are often the ones that slip away or that break first. And since they're most widely used, we go through these a lot. So having your own Fitches would be a great addition to your supply of materials, your tool bag. We'll use these a lot. Number 5 on my image here is a stencil brush. Notice how the effect of the brush above the brush, shown above the brush, is a very round, has a very rounded result, whereas the Fitch has a very skinny line. So that's why the Fitch is used for lining and laying out specific details. And that number 5 brush, that stencil brush, that's great for when you're tapping through a stencil. That you're just wanting to lay in a color without brushing, as it will mess up the technique underneath it or get underneath that stencil. Down at the bottom, I'm going to switch down to the bottom real quick before we do number 6 there. Number 7 is a trim brush. I don't have a lot of examples of these, but I found one of these in our cabinet. We don't have a lot of these. We don't use them a lot. These are great for painting into corners, and you see them a lot at the hardware store, because when you are painting a room, you need to get into the corner. You got a lot of those in houses, but you don't have a lot of corners in the theater, since we're usually painting these sets before they have corners put into them. So that is a trim brush. Going back to 6 is a specialty brush. This specifically looks like somewhat of a grainer brush, so that some of the bristles have been removed. An example in our shop of one that would have a similar effect is this brush here, a specialty brush. This is another specialty brush in our shop. A wallpaper brush could be used as a specialty brush. Anything that creates a different type of effect. And they don't necessarily have to be brushes either. A feather, for example, is a great tool for painting in the theater. We will use this in our marbling project. Other things are grainers, and grainers come in a wide variety. They could look like this, or they could look like this, and you use them in different ways. And so there are a lot of specialty brushes out there that do different things and different techniques. But as I said, the main brushes that you need to worry about are a lay-in brush and a Fitch. Lay-in brush, Fitch. You also want to know the 3 parts of a brush. What were they? What was this? That's the handle. What's this? That's the ferrule. What are these? The bristles. The 3 parts of a brush. Very important things to remember. Other equipment to take note of in the theater paint shop, we use tape a lot. Painter's tape is easily identifiable because it's blue. It's sometimes green, but you will typically see blue painter's tape here. Other tools, we have pneumatic sprayers, we have Hudson sprayers, ways of taking paint and adding water to them and spraying them down. We have tools for laying in the artwork, charcoal, floggers, pounce wheels. There is a wide variety of things in the paint shop. Funnels, strainers, mixing cups, all kinds of stuff. These are the primary tools, the brushes and the containers that we will be using, and we will slowly introduce some of the other tools that are necessary through your crew hours and through some of the projects that we do. Let's talk about paint and dye. Let's first talk about paint. So you have several qualities of paint that are important to the scenic painter. The level of opacity of the paint. Is it a wash or a glaze? A wash or a glaze would be when the paint is watered down and it glides over the other color. This is an example. Or maybe the paint is opaque, and when it is applied, it completely covers whatever the material underneath it is. All paints are classified as a suspension rather than a solution. What does that mean, though, right? So here's what a suspension is and why it is important. A solution has the different ingredients combining together and staying that way. They're in solution. A suspension combines those materials together, but they are constantly working to separate themselves. And so when we mix paint, the parts of the paint are constantly working to separate themselves. This means that we have to stir our paint a lot. But what are the parts of paint, right? What is separating in there? What is that stuff? Paint is composed of two primary ingredients. Well, we'll debate this a little bit. But the ones that are important to remember are the pigment and the binder. Those are the two required ingredients to paint. Pigment is the color. Is it red? Is it blue? Is it purple? And the binder is the glue that allows it to stick to the surface that you're trying to paint. Paint also contains water. As that water evaporates, as it's taken out of the container and applied to a surface, the water evaporates, allowing that paint to dry and the glue to stick to the surface. So the evaporation of that water is also very important. Finally, some paints are given to the consumer with fillers. Just items that, parts of the paint that fill up the leftover space between the binder and the pigment. And that can be a wide range of things. Let's talk about different types of paint. Let's start with dry pigments. Now, a lot of you are aware of dry pigments because if you've been into our paint shop, there is an area of our shop where several canisters full of dry pigments. All of these bins have dry pigments inside of them. This is the oldest and most classic technique of painting. For a caveman to make a painting, they would ground up a material into a powder, add a glue, or and a lot of times this was maybe an egg or animal fat as times progressed and techniques improved. That would work as a binder, a glue, to get it to stick to the wall. So we can use those. We don't, because some of them are carcinogenic, and I prefer to not have students using those materials. But we can use those to do nearly anything that we do with other paints. They can make nearly any color desired. When using these paints, it's important to remember your binder. One of the classic funny stories of the theater This is the time the painter painted an entire backdrop, and it looked beautiful, and it dried, and as they walked across it with their footsteps, the dried pigments came right up. If the dried pigment is simply mixed with water, when it dries, it will become just another dry powdered pigment again. So it actually needs to have that binder, that glue in it, in order to stick to the surface. And often you will want to seal the surface that has been painted to further protect it, because with water or other paint techniques on top of it, these have a tendency to come up more easily. The next type of paint that I want to talk about is casein paint. This is very popular for its ease of workability and the trueness of the colors. The binder contained in this stems from the protein found in milk. So sometimes they can get a bit smelly if you don't take good care of them, if you don't seal them up properly and use them as they are intended to be used. And we often allow that to happen in Scenic shop as we are working for an extended period of time. We're not just painting in one day. And if the lids aren't put on properly, that smell will come back as well. It works best when mixed with warm water. Dyes can be added to adjust the color, to deepen and strengthen the tone. It's completely waterproof when it is dry, which is great. One last thing. We have a fair supply of these, and we'll want to use them up first as we go about painting this semester. So primarily because they have the truest and best workability, truest color and best workability, and that I want to use them before they go bad if they're open. So if you find any, if you're looking for a color, look first for an Iddings deep color, and remember that these are kind of saturated. You will want to mix with water so that you're not applying straight pigment. These mix down quite a lot. So yeah, add up to 2 to 3 parts water for a brilliant opaque coating. So 2 to 3 parts water to 1 part of this is still opaque. You'd have to add even more water for it to even become a wash. So that gives you an idea of how much paint is really in this container. Let me go on to the next paint. The next type of paint that we're going to talk about is acrylic paint. We use these super saturated or the off-Broadway types of acrylics. Oh, I'm knocking stuff over here. Watch out. This is dangerous paint class today. I'm going to take that down. All right. So these are acrylic based paints that work in a similar fashion to the casein paints. They have a little bit more limitations in terms of color value, but they're great for washes, and that they can be thinned down to washes, and they're great opaque. I like these a lot. This is the paint that I opt to use myself, just for convenience. It's widely available in a lot of shops. This is what a lot of paint shops use. The higher quality shops, if you're in a drop shop, they're going to be using that casein paint. But most theaters will be using an acrylic-based paint. And they're very flexible. You can use this mixed in with casein, you can use it mixed in with latex. It's great. Speaking of latex, the next type of paint, latex paint. Latex has a tendency to gray in color slightly when it's dry. And it can be thinned, but not as much. It has the paint pigment binder filler ratio is a little different, and there's a lot of filler in it, and so it doesn't have a lot of binder. So that if you add a lot of water, you're going to need to add a lot of glue as well. This is true for a lot of the paints, that the more water that you add, you might need to add in more glue in there as well. Other things to know about are dyes. We have a wall of pre-mixed dye waters. These can start in powder form or in crystal form. One of the dyes to keep your eyes out for is called aniline dyes. These have serious health and environmental consequences. So while they were widely used before and are still used to a certain degree, it is important that as an industry we work away from these and develop better techniques for when we do need these. So if you are in a shop and told that you will be using aniline dye, make sure that you are using a proper respirator and that you have all of the equipment that you need to be truly safe and to properly dispose of the aniline dye that you're using. Finally, we have bronzing powder. It's called bronzing powder, but that can refer to gold or silver as well. It's not specific, it's just metallic. And so these are added to typically to sealers. You can add them to paints, but in sealers it allows it to float to the surface quite easily and to add that glistening finish. And so that is another type of paint technique that we will be using. And so now we've talked about the equipment, we've talked about the space, we've talked about the paint. Let's get going on onto the next subject, which will be color.